Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today with Jacqueline Leng. She is the SVP Client Solutions at Interpublic Group. She was previously at Oracle and has also had experience at startup ad tech companies. Welcome, Jacqueline.
Hi, Neeta. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you so much for joining us. Excited to talk to you today about the success of integration and or the things that didn't go well, depending on the perspective. And maybe just to set the table, I know you and I are both really interested in integrations and M&A, and I wanted to just reference some data that I have seen from McKinsey, and obviously they've been very active for a long time in terms of studying the efficacy of mergers. But one of the data points that they recently raised was that the first 12 to 18 months after a merger have really the harbinger of whether the deal is going to be successful or not. And I just think that's interesting as someone who didn't grow up in the M&A world, the importance of like really getting that integration piece right, because I think everyone has a lot of fun celebrating a deal and having a great exit, all things. But you have lived through almost a dozen acquisitions, if I have my numbers right, throughout your career. And you've been on both sides. You've been both part of the acquiring team and the acquiree. What have you seen and what was that experience like across your career?
Yeah, it's been an interesting experience. And I will say, I think since being educated and growing up in the ed tech world and the first dot-com boom, I'm really drawn to startup companies. And early on in my career, I'll just give you an example of the early stage and the later stage. In terms of what I've seen in my career, I was part of the sales organization, junior seller at MarketWatch.com, and they were purchased by Dow Jones. I want to say this is late 90s maybe, or early 2000s. But I didn't know anything about mergers and acquisitions. I just know that this Dow Jones is a big, well-known brand purchasing MarketWatch.com. It's exciting times for me. Now, later on in my career, I was at a startup called Associated Content, but purchased by Yahoo. And that was merging into a large behemoth of sales organization that's very well defined with mid-tier accounts, large team enterprise accounts, and how to navigate that and finding internal champions and to really showcase that early day wins. I think that's a key part tying into your point about really that first 12 to 60 months after a merger to see success. And then from a sales team's perspective, which is always where I sit, is really how do you bring the two very different sales teams together, learn each other's highlights, and then go out to market really quickly to drive that success. And where it really makes sense, where the two solutions complement very nicely, that's a great way to get that early wins.
So, in your experience, what makes an integration more successful? And maybe particularly from a sales team perspective, from a revenue perspective?
That's a good question. I think a lot of times is from what I've seen, it's more around the face. Before Interpublic Group, I was at Oracle, and Oracle is all about acquiring companies, and they are very methodical. They do their due diligence, and they amass a portfolio, a division. Like they basically build the ad tech stack through various acquisitions. Now, I think what I've seen where it worked well is the leadership has to really come together and identify joint opportunities, whether it's from the sales side or product side, and really starting with what's complementary. The example I'll give at Oracle, because they've acquired so many companies, they have a lot of hackathons that's done every year. They try to, as quickly as possible, bring the office space together. So there's that osmosis of just people meeting people, doing some happy hours. Oh, there's on the sales team for this agencies, and this person is my counterpart. What are you seeing? There's that conversation that just starts to foster. And I think doing things to bring the teams together, to bring the culture together and really collaborate, I think that's a big part of what drives the success.
How much do founders matter to the success? I know you've had some experiences with that on maybe both sides of the table. But what is your take on the founder side?
Yeah. So I think a lot of times when you're coming from a founder's perspective, it's your blood, sweat, and tears. You've built this. It's your emotional investments. However big, it's still something that they themselves have grew, right? I'll give you an example. When I joined Oracle shortly after they purchased an ad verification company called Moat. And the team has very tight core, tight culture, tight structure, a great way of working together. And there's some resistance from the leadership about integrating too quickly. And that results in some conflict. Even though we're sharing office space, the team doesn't come together as much. And from my seat, this is where the sales team couldn't come together to really identify those quick wins. And then as a company gets acquired, the momentum changes as well. So the revenue trajectory can be affected if you don't have those early wins. And that becomes a problem in this sort of key crucial time period of the 12 to 18 months. And there's a battle from the senior leadership to, we want to help you get to your revenue goal, but as the acquired company mode is resisting back, thinking that they can do it themselves. And that creates tension too, right? And those tensions, for better or for worse, stall the growth of where the trajectory could become.
Yeah, I can hear the emotional piece of that too, that maybe they just weren't ready to let it go and have it
Yeah.
really be part of a larger entity. Do you
Yeah.
think that if I'm looking back to that McKinsey data, do you think that it's the kickoff meeting and kind of the early stages of that year and a half that really matter? Or is there something else from a process perspective that you think is really effective in that integration stage?
I think I'll reference Oracle as an analytic. Again, just at that time, they were called the Oracle Data Cloud, and it was a really innovative venture. They started with a data management platform called BlueKai, and then they put the data into it through the acquisition of DataLogix, and they add some web tracking online data through Addis, and then they try to stitch it all together with Crosswise. This is all over the span of maybe 4 or 5 years. Then Mode was all about that intention measurement and verification. And then Grapeshot subsequently happened after I joined, is this contextual company. So you can see this whole sort of tech stack that's readily available. And I think what really to have worked well, I mentioned bringing out the office space together, but really it's about doing the due diligence and setting up the acquired company up for this success. And having the budget to bring the people together. We were part of a big kickoff, and a lot of people flew to Denver, and hundreds of people gathered together. It was also showcase. You really, I think sometimes my European colleagues can be a bit cynical and be like, oh, this is too raw. But it does work, and it does foster discussion, and it allows people to ask questions and have discussions. So that's where it went well. And I think where it didn't go well, we touched on that leadership conflict, right? And how do you stay separate and slow to integrate versus one that can quickly integrate and quickly drive that success? And that really is that ease of integration that could come in. And I wonder sometimes if the size matters too. If it's a bigger, medium-sized company versus a smaller startup company, we just don't have that many people. We don't have the coverage, so we can't compete. So we'll just let the acquired company do what they need to do. So I feel like there's some sweet spot in terms of how companies come together. And I think we're coming to a few key points that's top of mind there.
In terms of the lessons learned from some of the tougher integrations, aside from leadership, were there any other kind of process or just takeaways that you might share about what either you or other teams could have done differently without naming names necessarily? But
I would say, I think with leadership aside, I think that there has to be opportunities for the teams to interact. And in the cases where the teams can come together and identify where they have same coverage and share information, that infrastructure has to be provided either by the leadership or by the senior managers that can foster that discussion. If that's not happening, if one company that's being acquired is just sitting on the other side of the office and we're sitting on one side of the office and there's no attempt to even do some joint sales meeting, joint product meetings, or just joint town halls, then that's just two companies sharing the same space. And I think that's where there could be done more. I do think it ultimately has to come from the senior leadership. But without that, how do you keep that moving forward? And it's much harder for individual people to find those champions.
when it comes to pricing and business models, because that's also such a challenging area, I think, in a lot of integrations. Has that been your experience too? Or have you seen some best practices that we could learn from?
In terms of integrating the business models?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
pricing, right? Having two different price lists, comp plans, like all of that.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of any M&A is, I think, especially bigger companies like Oracle, they're very good at the paperwork.
Right.
Shifting all the employees to the same system, shifting all the employees to the contractual system, and having a phase stage plan. Like when your existing customer contract ends, we need to migrate them to these big Oracle contracts that have the right compliance and all that stuff in place. those are easy to implement. I think those are quick to map out. I think the challenge, again, is the intangible part of that, people and talent. How do you go back to my point? It's not just two companies sharing in the same space. It's two companies coming together and having conversations and identifying opportunities. And if you don't have that support, you don't have the encouragement to do that, then you're not going to do it. This business side, pricing model, contract, HR, those are easy to do. And big companies are very good at doing that. I think it's coming into terms with the personalities that makes it hard for the softer stuff to happen.
I know that in your role, you have a lot of responsibility and also the challenge of influence without authority when it comes to change management. And this is obviously hard for everyone in every org I've ever been in, especially the larger the org, the harder the change management, in my view. Do you have what is your take on how to lean into that process, how to do it better? Any takeaways, any suggestions?
I think, again, big companies, for better or worse, there's structures in place, there's teams in place. And my advice for joining those big systems is finding what are your champions, understanding who needs convincing, or who do you need to win over, or more importantly, who do you need to leave alone? Maybe there's some teams, I'll give the Yahoo example where I was a part of startup being acquired into Yahoo. And right away, we were talking to the enterprise sales team because they have the biggest accounts, they have the biggest brand names. And that's where they're very receptive to new innovations and ideas and leveraging a new purchase company solution. And then it was until, I think, 6 to 10 months down the line, we start to meet the mid-tier accounts that we flew to Omaha. There's a big team there that calls them mid-tier accounts or things like that. And the smaller accounts, that was a whole division. I don't even remember. That happened much, much, much later. So again, I feel like having a game plan of where's your immediate traction, where's your wins, and then where's that sort of mid to long-term opportunity can come in. And I always think when companies come together, and sales is probably the more straightforward piece. Product, roadmap, and sort of joint innovations comes much later. And I think where Oracle did well was having those hackathons where the team can just explore different ideas and encourage the engineers to brainstorm and come together and say, we have this idea and we have this need and this challenge. Do you have the solution that you can help us solve with this? And we've seen some great ideas come out of it, and some even got implemented into the product roadmap, which I think is really cool.
In your experience, then, is it that these sales teams actually had a lot in common before the integration? Because I've seen a couple examples, and again, tell me if you disagree with this, where the deal size is really different, or the way the team actually operates, even the relationships between sales and marketing are different pre and post acquisition. And so that's where it seems like there's friction, or has that not been? Your examples are more that you've seen like large enterprise teams, and it sounds like they're maybe more similar to begin with. Is that fair to say or no?
Yeah, I think it's about opening doors, right? So for, again, a smaller company, folding into a bigger company, the structure and the coverage and mapping of the agency stakeholders is just much more extensive versus a smaller company with a team of 30 that's just boots on the ground and focusing on tactical. So I do think there's benefits from a sales teams coming together, even if the product sets is very different. There's the sort of who's your coverage look like, and I'm being typical, but my perspective is from a startup sales organization. You do tend to have more of a younger, I interact with the buyers and not the sort of agency leadership. Those people are fewer in the startup company that's being acquired. Whereas later on in Oracle, they have the boots on the ground salespeople that knocks on doors kind of things. And then you have the partnership team that focuses on holding group level discussion and unifying pricing. And that structure and those kind of partnerships can really benefit the startup companies. And I'm an optimist, so I think it works well from that perspective.
Sure. And I do think for the example of an Oracle or Cisco, someone who's a serial strategic acquirer, I think they've figured out the patterns and processes. I'm curious for some of the other companies, because obviously I don't think it always, from the data, it doesn't seem like it always goes well for a lot of integrations.
Yeah, I will say, Neeta, from my perspective, I'm biased, right?
Yeah, you maybe
seen
the best.
It's a big company.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and the big company buying small companies. I think what would be interesting to see is the research and the insights around medium-sized companies coming together.
Yeah.
I could imagine that being a bit more rocky.
And even in some of the large versus large, right? Because who is the top dog? There's some great historical examples of that not always going well, but
I've seen those where the companies don't realize who's buying who from the employee's perspective, right? And then you
right.
quickly realize based on who's in charge, and that can create tension too. So again, I feel like anytime there's acquisition, the communication needs to be clear, the North Star needs to be clear, and that helps the teams move forward. Because change is tough, but change is always happening, right?
Yes. Yeah. Said. So given everything you've seen, like what is your advice to CEOs or to execs who are maybe newer to acquisitions and integration? Any tips or takeaways that you might recommend?
I think it's not easy for a first-time startup leader to really think about going through an M&A because there's just so much to cover, from even courting to signing the paper and what to negotiate. And then I've talked to some recent founders through Chief, which is the organization we got to know each other. There's a founder, a female founder, she realized there's things that she should have asked for in that merger and acquisition process. It's all a learning experience. But I think at the end of the day, it's important for the founders to be realistic, right? And you're giving something that you've built into somebody else, and it's no longer yours. So my best advice, and I've seen that at Oracle, is what's that they call a vest in peace period. And you may have frustrating moments, you may have disagreements on how it should be run, but ultimately you've handed this over. So what can you do in terms of driving that success in that 12 to 18 months? And then think about pivoting or next thing. And we have Oracle founders that have come into the fold that were put onto projects. I was helping some of the senior leaders that were part of the acquisition that were taking a back seat on project exploring the China market. So there's things like that to diversify a little bit and not be so completely vested and feeling that hurt and writing that frustration every day of, oh, you're tearing my company apart. I think it's not a good mental space to be in, but finding where you can control and finding projects you can own, I feel like that's the best place to be.
Yeah, it sounds like some therapy and like letting go also is probably, because you're right. I think it's really emotional for a lot of people when you're building a company. You get attached, understandably. It's part of what makes it great. And I think you're also alluding to the importance of having a really good attorney, good law firm, and strong advisors, right? And even just the question of making sure you're asking for things you need. And I think it's important to have a good team around you too. So,
there's a lot of checklists throughout that process. And I think at the end of the day, the emotion is the thing that gets into this whole process that makes it interesting and hard.
Yeah. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like to share about the integration experience or about M&A?
I think the vision in terms of how you lead the M&A is very important. I think we've seen companies that were bought for their technology. We've seen companies that were bought for their people. And the intention is always there on why we go buy this company. I don't know the intention is always there after the company's bought. And those steps needs to be very thought out. There's a lot of attention on identifying these companies. There's a lot of attention on negotiating it all come together. And then there's a little bit of attention on how HR people work, transferring and people come together. And then is there a 12 to 18 month plan about how the team needs to be integrated, how the culture needs to come together, how to foster communication. I feel like that's one area where a lot more can be done, just from my personal experience of seeing through all these acquisitions.
I think that's a really great insight. And last question then, what do you think that high performance companies do differently from kind of average performers in your experience, either specific to integration, M&A, or just broadly?
I think broadly, it's a clear vision. I think in any situation, acquisition or not, you need to think about where the long-term plan is. And this is why I'm a subscriber and listener of Good Revenue. It's not just about short-term, it's long-term. And once you have the long-term, it's easier to have the mid to short-term because which way you're going towards, you're not being reactive. That is definitely a case for M&A. That is definitely a case for any business operations. And that drives high-performing companies.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining us, Jacqueline. I knew this would be an interesting conversation, so we really appreciate having you.
I enjoyed it. It's always good to chat with you, Neeta.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us here at Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review, follow the show, or share it with a friend. We're a news show, so it really helps other listeners find us. And if you have feedback, comments, or suggestions for episodes or guests, please reach out to us. You can find our information in the show notes.